So welcome everyone to our online launch event of the ICR Toolbox, Tools for Reforming the Business Environment. My name is Susanne Reichenbach. I work with the ICR Facility and I will be your facilitator for today's session. Before we start, I want to give you some technical instructions. First, I need to mention that this session is recorded. I would also like to ask you to please mute your microphones. And if you have a question, you can type it into the chat box. Maybe also good to know, we will provide a French translation of the recording of the session afterwards. Today's online event is organized by the Investment and Climate Reform Facility, and we would like to show you a short video on the facility and the offer that we have for your organizations before we start with today's session. So for my colleagues in the background, you can start the video now. Thank you. So as you have seen, the ICR facility offers technical assistance to public and private stakeholders, such as policymakers or business membership organizations in African, Caribbean, and Pacific states, when they want to conduct initiatives to reform the business environment. And now we also compiled a publication with tools to conduct these reform initiatives, the Investment Climate Reform Toolbox, which we want to launch today. And the toolbox is designed to respond to common challenges which are faced by those who work to develop a business environment for a thriving, inclusive, and sustainable private sector. And in this toolbox, you will find straightforward, practical tools that require limited resources and time to apply, step-by-step guidances, templates, and lessons learned from applying these tools in practice. And before we start with our presentation, let's have a quick look at the agenda. So what we'll cover in the next 90 minutes, the session will be opened with welcoming words from our donors, the OACPS and the European Commission. Then we will give you an introduction on the ICR Toolbox. And afterwards, we will have a closer look at 3 specific tools we want to feature today, before you will have the opportunity to ask questions in the Q&A session with the speakers. So now I want to give the floor to Escipion Oliveira Gomez, Assistant Secretary General for Structural Economic Transformation and Trade from the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States. Mr. Oliveira Gomez, thank you for coming. You have the floor for the welcoming words.
Thank you very much, Susanna. For us, it's an honor to be here today. For those who do not know our organization, we're the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States. And we were created in 1975 through the Georgetown Agreement. And nowadays, we group 79 developing states from these parts of the world, like I said, Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific, promoting sustainable economic development and promoting the overall well-being of our populations. We are led by our Secretary General, His Excellency, Mr. George Rebelo Pinto Chikoti, who's from Angola. And we are really committed in working with partners as the European Union, but as well as the ones that are managing the ICR facility, which is a very important facility for us. That means SNV, GIZ, British Council, and Expertise France. Here we see really how we work together with 4 European Union member states and the European Commission together with our member states in order to improve the business climate. As you know, business climate is essential for your businesses to prosper and grow. This program is part of an overall strategy of the OACPS group with the European Union. This strategy was developed a couple of years ago and seeks really to have a holistic approach towards private sector development, in which we work on business climate. We have the ICR facility, but also other instruments that work at national, regional, and all OACPS levels, improving the business climate. We are also helping intermediary organizations in our member states to be more efficient, as to allow them to provide better services to companies and also businesses in their countries and regions, in order to make them stronger, and promoting local knowledge. We're also supporting the informal sector, and we're also supporting financially loans and blending facilities that are in place, again, at a national, regional, OACPS level. So this program is part of a comprehensive strategy put in place by the European Union and the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States in our quest to attain sustainable development. I've said it many times before, we're very proud of the work done by ICR, led by Mrs. Stephanie Khan and her team, and the fact that we're really working together with our private sector and with other international development agencies from member states of the European Union and the European Commission towards a better future. I just wanted to leave you with the words that we do believe that cooperation and dialogue are very essential, not only North-South, but also South-South. So this is something that today we'll be really participating today actively in this event with my colleagues, Mrs. Christian Leon and Yvonne Chileche, because we do believe that it is very important that this toolbox created by the team is very important, and we will be looking forward how we can enhance it. We are also we're expecting to have our contributions because we're always eager to learn and exchange. So please participate actively, ask questions, and in Brussels, we are at your entire disposal. We work through all the embassies and missions in Europe and in our countries, supporting the sustainable development of our states. Sorry for having taken so long, and at your disposal under the leadership of our Secretary General, His Excellency, Mr. George Rebelo Pinto Chicote. Thank you very much. Abrazos a todos.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oliveira Gomez, for your welcoming words. Actually, now we would also have welcoming words from Miguel Campo-Lopez, Policy Officer for Private Sector Development at the Directorate General for International Partnerships of the European Commission. But unfortunately, he had an urgent meeting and apologizes for not being able to participate today. So I suggest that we continue here. And as we have mentioned, the ICR Toolbox was written for public and private stakeholders. But before we introduce the Toolbox to you, we would be interested to get an impression from you, from the audience, and in which sector you are working in. So we invite you to answer to the following question, which should now open as a poll in the platform. And we would like to know in which sector you're working in. Are you from the public sector, such as from a government agency, from the private sector, such as from a business membership organization or from of commerce, or from an international development or international organization, or just from a different sector? So you can type in your answer, and let's see what we get as results. So, okay, we have quite a mixed audience. We have participants from the private sector with around 30%, and then around 50 from international development and international organization, and also some from public sector and government, but not many from other organizations. So yeah, that's interesting to know. It's always good to know who is in the virtual room nowadays with our digital formats, so we get a better feeling of the audience. And as announced, we are now proud to officially launch the ICR Toolbox, which you can find now in the chat box. There you can find the download link for the ICR Toolbox. And Ben Fowler and Friederike Strupp from Market Share Associate, who are the authors of the Toolbox, they will give you now an introduction to the publication. So please, Ben and Friederike, you have the floor, and I also invite to quickly introduce yourselves.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, I'm very happy to have the opportunity to speak with you today. And yes, would like to really have the opportunity to, before we get into the toolbox, which we're very excited about having the chance to officially launch after many months of effort, give a quick background to who we are as the Toolbox authors. My name is Ben Fowler. I am a co-founder of Market Share Associates, and I have nearly 20 years of experience working in private sector development, business environment reform, social impact measurement, and learning facilitation. I've worked across a range of multilateral and bilateral institutions, governments, and private sector companies, supporting the creation and the measurement of social impact. I'm pleased to also present my co-author, Frederica Stroop. She is an expert in social inclusion and gender with a particular focus on policy analysis. And she is a research associate at Market Share Associates. For a quick background to Market Share Associates, who we both work for, it is a global consulting firm with a mission to bring actionable insights to economic development. We work on business environment reform and investment climate reform for over a decade across the ACP countries, both from a research as well as a practical implementation side. Across all the engagements that we do, we bring a systems thinking lens, as well as tools for social inclusion and behavioral diagnostics. With that, I'll now move to the toolkit itself that I know we're all waiting for. The tool has been a process. There's the cover page for this new toolbox. And when we were in the process of developing the toolbox, it quickly became apparent that there are a lot of different existing tools and toolboxes out there, including one very recently produced by the EC. It was therefore really important for us to determine what additional value could such a toolbox add? How is it going to engage and interact and really build on what's already in existence? And we identified a few places where we felt this toolbox could have the most impact. First, by being extremely practical and hands-on. Something that we noticed is that a lot of the toolboxes that exist tend to be very long and include many, many dozens of tools and provide a little bit of information about each, but not always provide a lot of detail for somebody who wants to apply them, who then has to go to the original tool and really dig in to try and understand how they can use it. We wanted to design this toolbox a little bit differently. We wanted it to be very hands-on with a lot of practical guidance, practical examples of how to apply the tool, and to start the toolbox by guiding the user so that they can pick which tool is relevant for them based on the specific issues or challenges that they're facing. So they don't have to read the toolbox from start to finish in order to determine which is the portion of the toolbox which is going to add value to them. A second place that we focused on with this toolbox design, in which we felt there is a difference with what's already out there, is in terms of the target audience. Many of the existing toolboxes have an orientation towards those who have funded them, particularly bilateral and multilateral donors, as well as the implementing partners that are implementing those initiatives. This toolbox instead is focused at an audience of policymakers and private sector actors within the ACP countries. And finally, a third area in which we designed this toolbox and we think it has some difference with existing tools is that we put a very strong emphasis on incorporating several cross-cutting priorities, those being private-public dialogue, environment, gender, digital, and fragile contexts. We did not simply put a portion of the toolbox to focus on those issues, but instead have integrated it throughout the toolbox. So every single tool examines the ways in which that tool can help to support the aims of private sector dialogue or gender, for example. So that's woven throughout the entire toolbox. So a next thing that we had to quickly wrestle with in this process is that there are dozens and dozens of tools for BER and ICR. Of course, we didn't have the space, nor would it have fit with our approach to try and include them all. So it quickly became important to decide what were the criteria that we were going to use to decide which tools we would include. And we landed ultimately on 6. The first of these is that what we were including was actually a tool. Now that might sound a little bit silly to say, but there are a lot of resources out there that a user could not actually pick up and practically apply, either because it's a case study, it's a full toolbox, or in some cases, there are many excellent resources out there that are 200 or 300 pages long, and they have an enormous amount of great guidance in them. But for somebody that has limited time, they are a little bit overwhelming. So we wanted to focus in such long resources, were there one or a couple of key tools within them that would interest a user and be practical and easy to apply. A second criteria that we looked at was ensuring the relevance of those tools to ACP policymakers in the private sector. That meant, for one, that the tools were publicly available. It meant that no proprietary tools, for example, would be included. It also meant that they needed to be straightforward, and they needed to be tools that had usually a track record of application within ACP, so that they weren't tools that perhaps were only working in different country contexts and didn't have the applicability within the ACP countries. A third criterion that we used was that we wanted to include tools that were broadly relevant, that could be used by a wide variety of those implementing BER initiatives. And that meant we excluded any tools that were specifically focused on a functional area, such as tax reform. We instead looked at ones that were applicable across a wider variety of the cycle. We wanted tools with detailed guidance available so that they are ones that could be applied by the audience, that there wouldn't be questions about how specifically to put one of these tools into practice. We also wanted to make sure, of course, that the tools we were including were of a minimum quality level. That meant ensuring in the process of our research that we were actually understanding whether that was the case or not, and making sure we were getting some validation of the quality level. Finally, when we looked at the portfolio of tools that we were including, we wanted to make sure that the full set was not redundant, that there wasn't overlap, that they were adding value to each other, and that they ultimately covered all 4 phases of the BER cycle. And that takes me to the next slide around the BER cycle. So one of the key ways that we organized this toolbox was in terms of the 4 business environment reform phases that was created by the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development. And this is a framework that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and which has been a very enduring framework widely used since its creation. It includes 4 phases that any BER initiative will typically. That includes first a diagnosis, so understanding what are the BE issues in which you're going to focus. Secondly, design, which focuses on what type of initiative you're going to do, how it's going to be organized, etc. A third phase of implementing the initiative. And finally, an evaluation and sustainability phase, in which you're understanding the results that the initiative has created and putting in the steps for future sustainability. This toolbox has been organized around those 4 phases so that each tool is noted which phase it most appropriately applies in. As I noted before, one of our key priorities was to make sure that a user that wants to understand and use this toolbox doesn't need to read it from start to finish. Instead, they can identify what are the key questions or challenges that they're facing and understand which tools are most appropriate to address those challenges. So here we have a couple of example tables from the toolbox which show specific questions that might be asked and a relevant tool. So for example, a user might ask, what are the key political roadblocks and risks that could derail my reform efforts? And for that, in addressing that question, one relevant tool from the toolbox is the everyday political analysis. And so if that's the interest of the user, then you can go directly to that chapter and start immediately understanding how you can use that tool for your purposes. The toolbox is also organized up front with a very simple outline of the different tools that are included within it. That again allows the user to have at a glance an understanding of which tools are being used and what do they contain. So that includes an objective for each tool. It includes the target group for the use of the tool. It includes an assessment of the time, expertise, and cost required, as well as the relevant BER phase or phases, because in many cases, a tool is relevant for more than one phase. It's important to note with the time and expertise and cost analysis that we did, you can see on the right that there's an assessment of the approximate time required or the breakdown of what kind of low, medium, and high means. But it's important to note that even the tools that are ranked as high really are medium, at least in the broader context, because of course we only chose tools to include in the toolbox that were easy to apply, that were approachable, that didn't require a huge amount of resources. And that ended up meaning that a lot of very interesting tools were not ultimately included because of that particular criterion. So I'll turn it over now to Susanna to do the next question.
Yes, because now we have a next question to the audience. So thank you, Ben and Friederike, for this first overview of the ICR Toolbox. And yeah, actually the question that we have now for you, for the audience, is whether there are any specific cross-cutting issues regarding business environment reform that are of particular interest to you. For example, gender, green economy, conflict and fragility, digital and technology. Or maybe also another cross-cutting issue, which we did not list here, and then you can specify it in the chat box. That would be interesting for us to know. So we are waiting for the results. Okay, that's interesting. So 56% are interested in gender, 44% in green economy, 25% in conflict and fragility, and 50% in digital and technology. So yeah, it's quite mixed, I would say, but with a key focus on gender and green economy. And maybe Ben and Friederike, now when you present the tools to us, you could also tell us a little bit more how the tools take up the cross-cutting issues, because yeah, I think that would be quite interesting.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so in total, the toolbox contains 14 tools. We're not going to introduce each and every one of them to you, but we want to give you a little bit of a flavor of what to expect, and hopefully this will, this will make you want more and read more about it. So this is an overview of a range of tools that cover different phases. As you can see, each of the tools always at the beginning has this little profile that we've copied here that makes it really easy to get a quick overview of what phase the tool relates to, what is its objective, what is the target group, and also our assessment of the time, expertise, and cost required. So to walk through some of these examples, one that we selected was the competitiveness impacts of business environment reform, also known as cyber, a bit less of a mouthful, a tool that was developed by DAI for USAID. This one is a great tool at the diagnostic phase, which can be used to shortlist, prioritize, and cost the business environment reform that will have the greatest impact on specific value chains, and that is feasible to assess. So it's quite a bottom-up method for selecting the right BER challenges based on specific value chains or sectors. And in that, it's complementary to some of the other diagnostic tools that we have in the toolbox. For example, we also feature growth diagnostics, which looks more at constraints at a macro level, and other tools that look at these more cross-cutting issues, for example, a gender diagnostic checklist. Then we have results chains, a tool developed by the DCED that is a really great and simple tool to visually describe the linkage between planned activities and the final impact. So it's quite similar to a theory of change. And as you can see, we suggested that this be used throughout the design, implementation, and evaluation phase. So it's a tool that should be developed quite early on when the reforms are designed, basically to come up with the theory of how does the reform, that we're trying to pass impact what we're trying to impact, and then should be reviewed quite regularly, for example, on a quarterly basis, and it will help to clarify what results are we expecting, what's the logic of the intervention, what are our critical assumptions, and then in the end also to see, are we on track with what we were trying to achieve. We also have another tool from the DCD in the toolbox with a range of indicators to measure the success of the BER initiative at the evaluation stage. Now, problem-driven iterative adaptation, for example, is a tool that is useful again also across several phases. And it's not just a tool, it's actually a full approach to tackling development problems differently. It's a way to enable reformers to take an adaptive and learning-focused approach, both to problem discovery and then to the development and design of solutions. So instead of very top-down, upfront planning, this approach enables the policymakers and reformers to remain nimble, to focus on testing and adapting ideas rapidly through a series of sprints and iterations. This tool can be used to deconstruct the problem and to understand the root drivers, but then also to prioritize action steps based on the capacity and the feasibility. Now, at the end of the day, reforms aim to elicit behavior changes. You obviously want businesses to act or react in a certain way. And so we also featured the behavioral analysis and social norms diagnostic tool that was actually developed by Marketer Associates ourselves. And that tool helps you understand what are the behavioral and normative drivers of the agents in the economy. Why do they behave the way that they do? And then when you design a reform, analyze what are these crucial norms that could maybe prevent a reform from being successful, or how can we basically design that policy better so that it actually targets the kind of behaviors that we want to change. Next slide, please. Great. So as Susanne mentioned earlier, we have a specific focus on public-private dialogue throughout the toolbox, and it's a cross-cutting issue for all the tools, but we also included a range of tools that are specifically focused on PPD. And why is that? First of all, because we believe that the inclusivity of the reform process is a goal in itself. So we hope that this toolbox can be a great means to ensure that the voices of the private sector, of women, of workers, of businesses are better represented in the reform process. And also second, because the political economy of reform is really a key make or break condition for any BER initiative. So we think it's really important to actually analyze what is the political environment and what is feasible to do before coming up with solutions. So to present a range of those kind of tools, for example, we featured everyday political analysis, which was developed by the University of Birmingham, which, unlike other tools for the political economy that can be very long and complex, this one is really practical, easy to apply, helps with a very rapid analysis of the key stakeholders, the key decision makers in the political environment, and understanding what are the roadblocks, who do I need on my side, who are the potential allies and the potential detractors. The advocacy capacity building tool was developed by the ILO and is actually part of a wider range of tools and resources that they've developed to support business membership organizations, in particular in business environment reform processes, and build their capacity. So it's quite a toolbox in itself. So we selected a few sub-tools basically from those resources that would help not only BMOs, but also other advocacy organizations, be it chambers or unions or anyone basically engaged in the reform process, to for example, identify their supporting and opposing forces, writing more effective press releases, and developing a range of advocacy targets and tactics. The stakeholder dialogues tool from the Collective Leadership Institute in GIZ is a more wide-ranging tool to even assess, when are the conditions even right for starting a PPD process. Is the PPD the right approach to take? Is it well designed? Does it create the necessary momentum? And then also evaluating later, did it work? What can be improved? And so this chapter, we draw mainly the tools from the Collective Leadership Institute, but also was really strongly informed by the insights from the IFC's PPD handbook and its author, Benjamin Hertzberg. Lastly, and I'm not going to say much about this because we're going to present it in more depth, we also have a gender-sensitive public-private dialogue checklist that was developed by the World Bank and is meant to support out-of-the-box thinking in designing more inclusive PPD formats, both in terms of who participates in the process and in terms of what are the outcomes, and then also can be used to evaluate PPD processes on the same criteria. So lastly, just a quick overview. Each of the tool chapters is structured in the same way. So again, to make it very easy for the reader to know what they have to look for and where they're going to find it. Each of the tools has an introduction where, we just quickly describe what's the purpose, who created it, how has it been used before, then a very detailed tool description and with the steps how to apply it. Then the steps of application in a summarized form, and for the tools where we did find a case study, we also have that here and basically can show exactly how it's been done in practice. Then we have a section on integration of PPD and these other cross-cutting themes, and at the end also discussing some lessons learned and success factors. And there I also really want to thank again to the many experts and tool authors that we've interviewed throughout this process, because their inputs have been really invaluable, especially when it comes to understanding what it means to put these things into practice. So many of the lessons come from them.
Great. So what we're going to do now, we've given you an overview, not of all 14 tools, but of several of them. What we now want to do is focus and do a deep dive on 3 of the tools. So we're going to start with one of them that's called the Green Investment Strategy Diagnostic. So as I mentioned near the beginning, one of the particular areas of focus for this toolbox was that we incorporate several cross-cutting priorities, and one of them was an environmental focus. Interestingly, though, as we began to look across the available tools to find out which ones might be most appropriate to include within the toolbox, we found that there were a lot of tools focused on BER, there were a lot of tools focused on green growth, but very few that actually bridged the gap between the two. And of those that did exist, we found that they weren't always designed in a way that would make them very practical, that being another one of our key criteria. So with that recognition, as part of the toolbox development process, we actually developed as market share associates 2 additional green tools. So I'm going to focus on one of them, but collectively they're called green, or green reform of the enabling environment. The first tool is a green integration checklist. And this one is a more light touch tool designed for policymakers who have identified BER initiatives they would like to move forward and are wanting to understand how they can best incorporate a green lens, a green growth lens into it, and to what extent that is realistic and feasible based on availability of resources, the context, the mandate they've been given, et cetera, et cetera. So this checklist is a series of short questions that the user can apply and research in order to determine and check for themselves what's the appropriate level of integration of a green lens into their BER initiative. The second of the 2 tools is a more in-depth one. It's called the Green Investment Strategy Diagnostic. And this tool is meant for policymakers that are taking a more explicit approach on wanting to harness and spur green investment, and they're wanting to essentially understand what policy tools are most appropriate to do so. This tool builds upon a lot of research that's been done recently, including recent research by the World Bank, which was focused on understanding what are the key drivers of green investment and how can that be supported and encouraged by policymakers. And ultimately, 3 key strategic objectives emerge from that research as essentially key drivers of green investment. One of those is to encourage existing firms that are already operating to become more sustainable and make greener investments. A second strategy is to encourage the startup and the growth of new firms with a green focus. And then finally, a third avenue is through foreign direct investment, attracting it and bringing it in focus towards sustainable sectors and away from more polluting sectors. So there are, within the toolbox, within this tool, for each of those 3 strategic objectives, a diagnostic framework, which is meant to help the user identify what are the real binding constraints that are impeding development within this area and impeding green investment. First, although there are 3 strategic objectives, it's certainly not the case that all are going to be relevant for particular policymakers, whether that's for policy reasons or just the practicality that some of those strategic objectives are actually functioning quite well, and there's only a need to focus on particular ones. So the diagnostic framework provides a visual tool that identifies several of the key drivers of that strategic objective, and therefore allows the user to also identify where there might be an issue. This is complemented by the table at the right, which provides in more depth what are the key questions that can be used to investigate and identify those binding constraints. It also includes a rationale for why that is an important question to analyze and why that might make a difference in supporting the strategic objective. And then it also includes a range of policy options and examples of where those policies have been applied. Obviously, these will depend very much on the particular use case, the context, etc., but they provide a set of options that the user can consider when they're deciding what's going to make the most sense in their context after they've identified the binding constraints. In terms of how to apply this tool, typically a really good first step is to conduct a strategy workshop with key informants that can help determine apply this diagnostic frameworks and identify the priority strategic objectives. This can also be a great opportunity to map the landscape and do a capacity assessment to understand what's going to be feasible within the context. A second step after that initial framing is to go into a deeper dive to collect data on the diagnostic questions, and that can be useful in combination with some PPD consultations. This should help identify some initial policy ideas, vet them, and validate them, which all leads to the third step, which is around the strategy development and policy design process. One case study, not that specifically used this tool, of course, since it's new, but that used essentially a lot of the same process and steps, was in Indonesia, where there was a challenge faced with port waste. So essentially, there wasn't a very functioning system for addressing that issue. The rules around reporting were quite cumbersome, and there were relatively few providers of waste management services. A new system was brought into place that included both an online kind of application or notification, as well as a connecting system between shipping agents and waste management operators. And this was a great example because it shows in essence how you can actually see benefits being created both from the environmental as well as the green investment perspectives. In that you had new firms entering to provide waste management services, existing companies invested and made green investments to reduce their pollution, ultimately there was reduced pollution, and government capacity was also enhanced in a way that can be deployed to other initiatives. So when we step back for a second and look at what can be helpful and what are the success factors that really drive effective use of a tool like this green tool, a first recognition is that strong environmental policies are really a prerequisite. There's often an understanding or a belief that perhaps such policies will impede investment and even maybe green investment. Actually, that's research that suggests that's typically not the case, and that green BR is actually supported by weak environmental standards. It certainly cannot substitute for weak ones. Another key finding around applying this tool is that in thinking about the incentives that are going to drive green investment, to primarily focus on leveraging business confidence around the economic opportunity, as well as legal obligations. Relying on corporate social responsibility as a driver of green investment is a tenuous course, and frequently we'll see reversals. I think a last point to note is that this ultimately really relies on also confidence in the enduring nature of the policies that are in place, the green policies. And so that's a really important consideration as policymakers are applying this tool, is that that transparency really exists in terms of, and that confidence exists among the private sector that any new policy or legislation is going to be durable. And so long-term investments that they're making are going to be rewarded under that context. And with that, I'll pass it over for the discussion of our second featured tool.
Thanks so much, Ben. So as announced earlier, the second tool we want to talk through, and also really exciting to see when we did the poll earlier, that gender is really one of the key concerns for the participants here as well. So I'm glad that we included this one, not just from a PPD but also from a gender perspective. So if we can go to the next slide, this tool draws from a paper that was written by the World Bank, published by the World Bank, on gender dimensions of investment climate reform. And it contains a checklist of various aspects of PPD facilitation, and should really help organizations that facilitate and convene these kind of stakeholder consultations throughout a PPD process to ensure that those are more gender inclusive. And so I have posted here the sort of headers of the different sections of the checklist. Each of these also have sub-criteria that that basically provide more detail on each. But you can see that this includes, for example, what is the mandate of this PPD process and of the institution that's leading it? How does it fit in, with the already existing institutions? And then looking at, for example, does the mission statement address gender equality? Is gender equality somehow part of how the PPD partnership works and has been brought together? What are the respective contributions of men and women throughout the setup of these partnerships? And so the checklist really looks at the process. So how does the participation work? How are men and women included? Is the facilitation set up in a way that is gender friendly? For example, if say a workshop or a committee meeting was late at night in an area of town that was maybe not so safe, or at a time where it's really difficult for women to find childcare, then that would be something to take into consideration there, making sure that women actually have the mobility to get there, that they actually feel safe in the place where the PPD takes place, and that in the broader concept of their life and in the times of day, it basically fits in when they are actually available. And then it also looks at the actual outputs and the outcomes of the PPD process, as well as at several sort of special topics, I would say, such as subnational or sector-specific questions around PPD, but then even includes also some considerations of post-conflict and some considerations for development partners in particular. So, you know, if some here in the audience are from organizations that are, you know, development partners rather than government or private sector stakeholders, basically for them to reflect on how do they fit into the process and how can they support inclusion and make sure that they don't, you know, potentially stand in the way of it. If you move on to the next slide. There we go. So in the original resource, this was meant as an evaluation framework. So basically set up to analyze an already existing PPD structure or a past PPD process and look at, okay, how inclusive was this? And so when doing that, you know, we would suggest, you know, developing a survey and just connecting with as many stakeholders as possible that were involved in that particular policymaking process and analyzing what were some of the major gender gaps. We thought that it would also be really interesting, rather than just doing this ex post, to have this checklist as sort of as a benchmarking tool. So something to use throughout the design and implementation of the PPD consultations to basically help the organizations that facilitate them and convene them to keep checking back when they design them to make sure that the formats are actually more inclusive. And so we hope that the tool can be used this way as well. And one example here was from the IFC that wrote a follow-up paper on gender inclusive PPD as well. They worked with the Cambodian Ministry of Women's Affairs and through that helped the establishment of a Cambodian Women Entrepreneurs Association, as well as making sure that the members of the associations are not only part of a committee of like one gender committee themselves, but they are actually included in the already existing PPD working groups, and that really helped to ensure not only to put the focus on you know, women entrepreneurs' needs specifically, but also to make sure that they're actually included throughout the different topics and that they could basically raise their issues and bring them on the agenda throughout the various sectors. And this is actually one of the key lessons learned. We can move on to the next slide. Not sure how to do that. Thank you. This is actually one of the key lessons learned here in the end to mainstream a gender perspective. So there is value to having a specific women's working group or a specific women's committee to sort of put a spotlight on that. But that also brings the danger of this being sort of pigeonholed into, you know, we have this one committee and now the problem of gender is ticked off. So rather than doing only that, one of the lessons learned, I think, from this tool is to make sure that women and women's and gender concerns are actually included across the different committees and PPD structure, and to really focus on this mainstreaming perspective. Another good lesson is to be specific. Policymakers as well as, you know, other leaders love to make very, you know, broad commitments to gender equality and often also mean them, but if they are not specific, if they don't have targets, if they're not concrete, if they're not achievable, it will be very difficult to achieve them. And so we think that this checklist, for example, is a really good way of, you know, moving from this broad idea of an inclusive policy process to making this very concrete and like what can be done. And then lastly, think about the political economy and looking for allies. As always, you know, processes already exist. There will already be vested interests and already existing organizations with power that want to defend the status quo. So when you want to bring in somebody new and some new voices to the table, it's possible that there will be some pushback. So understanding that, getting commitments from some of the key decision makers and key influencers, potentially even some, you know, gender champions that can push for this is really important. And so, as you know, we have a bunch of tools here as well around the political economy analysis. So in order to do that, you can grab the EPA or the advocacy capacity building tool, and hopefully that'll be helpful as well.
So now we'll turn it over to John to present on the third featured tool, Policy Hackathon.
Yes, so thank you, Ben and Friederike, for your presentation for presenting the two tools with a gender focus and a focus on green growth. And as you mentioned, Ben, now we want to feature a third tool, the Policy Hackathon, which was developed by I4 Policy, and John Stewart, who is the catalyst of I4 Policy, will present this tool to you. And to give you a short introduction, John Stewart is leading on the development of new methodologies to engage local communities in national, regional, and global policy design. He is currently coordinating the Central Circle of the Global Assembly on the Climate and Ecological Crisis. John also facilitated the co-creation of the Africa Innovation Policy Manifesto and is the co-founder and managing director of the Innovation for Policy Foundation. John has advised more than a dozen of African governments on public policy co-creation, and he serves in a number of advisory roles, such as the African Union Commission's and European Commission's Digital Economy Task Force. Thank you, John, for being part in today's event and for presenting the Policy Hackathon. I hope you can move the slides, and I will pass over to you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, for this kind introduction. Hello, everyone. I see we have about 55 people on the call, so I hope you're enjoying the presentations so far. I'm here indeed to talk about the Policy Hackathon tool, and I'm actually quite happy that Suzanne mentioned the African Union and European Union's Digital Economy Task Force, the report of which really emphasized the importance of public policy co-creation, particularly for innovation, entrepreneurship, and digital economy. And it's really in the spirits of that we developed this tool. For many people familiar with innovation communities, you might have heard the term analogy of a hackathon before, often used when often used for developing applications of software. And so when we were actually starting with I4 Policy and thinking about how can we engage the entrepreneurs that are involved in creating businesses with their governments to be able to foster a better business environment, we started thinking about how could we create tools that for which the terminology wasn't something different or something that they had to learn, and to start to use sort of even techniques and tools of open space technology that they were really familiar with. So it's really how this tool was developed. And I also just want to share that this is a tool indeed that we've used in more than a dozen governments and countries across the continent, and in more than 30 events. So it's something we have quite a bit of experience actually deploying. So let me just see if I can control the PowerPoints. I think that, yeah, here we go. All right, so just for a quick overview of what the Policy Hackathon is. So essentially what it does is it abbreviates the sort of diagnosis of the problems, what we at I4 Policy call the agenda setting phase. So we really understand what are the key problem statements and issues affecting entrepreneurs, recognizing of course that the entrepreneurs themselves are the experts in entrepreneurship often. So they're really diagnosing the issues that they face. They're prioritizing those during the Policy Hackathon, and then they also engage in brainstorming and even into crafting of policy recommendations directly throughout the event. So in terms of the actual steps of application, this is of course quite stylized. In terms of preparation, you could prepare for a Policy Hackathon in some cases for a week. You could also prepare for a year. The most important point here to recognize is that the Policy Hackathon itself, it's really important to make sure that it's situated in an overall policy reform process, and to make sure that when you're entering the Policy Hackathon, it's really clear what you're trying to achieve. And when I say what you're trying to achieve, I really mean that from the broadest possible perspective, to make sure that the government really has an ambition to whether it's to change a law or review certain regulations, and similarly that the ecosystem is really also on board with a sort of common vision for what is actually the possibility of reform. So that can be really clearly articulated and a kind of framing question for the hackathon itself. In general, the outreach, again, this is stylized. It can, you can be inviting people for months or for a week, but it's really about just making sure that you have the opportunity to engage widely, so that you're not sort of listening to that filter bubble of people that are often being consulted or engaging in public policy dialogue around the particular ministry, around the particular topic, but to really go out, make sure that, for example, if we're talking about entrepreneurship and innovation, that you're bringing in young university students as well as experienced startup founders, perhaps startup founders that may have exited, and supporting in terms of early stage angel investment or venture capital. So it's just really important to spend time with the outreach to make sure that it's open, and also to make sure that it's not just fully curated list of people, that you really create opportunities, this what you would call open for all invitation in the deliberative democracy space. There's really an open invitation for people to participate. And then the final step is the delivery of the hackathon itself, which generally we see taking place over at least 2 days. And those days, not necessarily back to back, but generally a big part of the policy hackathon itself is making sure that the facilitators are trained, and that the facilitators themselves are not coming from a consultancy or from the government or from a development partner or from civil society, but that the facilitators of the hackathon are themselves coming from the ecosystem. So community conveners, experienced entrepreneurs, etc., that are really able to host the event themselves. So I'll go ahead and go on from this idea of the actual preparation phase into the event itself. Oh, sorry, I'm jumping around here with the slides. There we go. So generally we see this is a sort of what we call a cheat sheet for, this is what we would often offer to the organizers to be able to keep track of the event schedule. This is presupposing that this is a one-day event. The hackathons that we often conduct are one day, but we've also held multi-day events. We've adapted this to online formats during COVID, for example. So we break this schedule up into 3 or 4 separate workshops, for instance. But this is an overview of what the events, kind of the key components of the event, and what this could look like over the course of the day. Generally, we start off with about an hour of goal setting and co-creating the norms of discussion, and making sure that really comes from, again, from the ecosystem itself, and making sure at the end of this first session of the event that everyone has a common understanding of why they're there and what they're trying to do, what the day is going to look like, and they're really empowered to contribute. The next section of the event is usually about 2 hours, and we co-create problem statements. So we usually use what we would call a modified world cafe. So we break a room, it depends, between 60 participants. We've had up to 150 participants. We would break the group up into smaller circles, and they would basically discuss, oftentimes we'll break it up into looking at ideation phase of entrepreneurship, registration setup phase, and then growth phase of entrepreneurship. And then we'll basically rotate the members of the group, of the attendees, basically to discuss each of these different thematic areas, to be able to elevate some different issues. And then we go from this phase into a sort of rapid prioritization of issues along each of these different phases. We'll then go into a brainstorming phase. We often use a role play here because it's statistically and scientifically proven to expand creativity. So we usually will offer a game such as, we'll have a telephone ring, and one of the facilitators will let everybody in the audience know that it's the president calling, that they have been appointed as the new minister, for example, of digital economy or of business development, whatever the case may be, and they have their lunch break to think about what their breakthrough idea is to be able to solve some of the challenges that they surfaced in the previous session. And so then we'll come back from a lunch, for instance, and then we'll listen to all of the participants. We really encourage everyone to be able to share their ideas. And so what we do then is we're crowdsourcing a bunch of ideas from the entrepreneurs themselves about how to solve the challenges that they themselves have identified. And so we then start to cluster these ideas, and then in the final session of a one-day policy hackathon, we'll then go into breakout groups where the participants will then start to basically develop these ideas into really concrete policy proposals. So again, this is a kind of a stylized overview of the event. It's obviously really important that it's contextualized locally, that it's organized locally, you know, that we really take into consideration all of the different elements that are going to make this really effective. But the overview here is that we're trying to fit into an abbreviated session an opportunity for entrepreneurs to become policymakers and to be able to empower them to go through a process to be able to surface their understanding of the challenges and their potential ideas of what solutions might look like. So I'm just going to share with you a little bit of an example. This is extracted from a case study that the Innovation for Policy Foundation has developed to be able to share what we call the Innovation for Policy process, which is essentially a policy cycle. You can see that on the right-hand side, we go from agenda setting into the drafting phase, into the implementation phase of a policy design. And the policy hackathon really bridges multiple elements of a policy cycle, all the way from what we call uniting, which is developing that common interest, to defining the challenges, prioritizing them, ideating, and then into the actual design itself. And in the case of the co-creation of the Senegalese Startup Act, for instance, we started the work in May 2018. We then organized, so in May 2018, we organized a roundtable public event with the World Bank, with the Minister of the Presidency, with key startup founders, and tried to discuss what could be a common interest. Everyone agreed, let's create a Startup Act. Let's try and leverage the knowledge within the startup ecosystem and craft a really unique law in Senegal to be able to solve these challenges. And then in July, we organized a one-day training for members of the ecosystem. And then the Innovation for Policy Foundation essentially supported them to organize a policy hackathon on the 20th of July, 2018. And that was, we had about 60, actually I think we had about 80 people from the ecosystem in Dakar and across the country come together. This was, what you're seeing here is going through the clustering phase of the brainstorming, this World Cafe session in the morning where we're doing problem definition. And then we went from this phase into essentially a whole series of activities. So again, it's why it's important to really situate the policy hackathon in the policy cycle. So we went from this kind of, you know, unifying moments of identifying a common interest. We organized the policy hackathon in July 2018. And it actually went through several rounds of iteration after that. There ended up being 20 versions of the Senegalese Startup Act by the time it was actually approved by cabinet at the end of 2019 rather. So it was a 19-month process before it was passed into law. And what's important to recognize is that after the policy hackathon, the product, the attendees actually managed to shape a draft law. So at the end of this one-day event, it's very abbreviated. They were already able to have a full draft version of the Startup Act by the end of this day. The day ended late. They stayed until actually 3 o'clock in the morning that night because their enthusiasm was that high. And they were able to draft the first draft of what became the Senegalese Startup Act and then take that into a discussion with the government the following morning. This then went into, again, 18 more months of co-creation, essentially. They had an online consultation chatbot that they launched, which we basically used a conversational chatbot on Facebook Messenger to reach more than 500 entrepreneurs across the country. And then this went into a co-creation committee that brought together members of the ecosystem, members of the government to continue working on the law with the support of an external local legal firm called which is just exceptional digital economy firm in West Africa. And then this went into a town hall meeting with the president in November. Co-creation committee in 2018, and then all the way through several more rounds of revision until it was approved at the end of 2019. And I'll just share with you this overview of the lawmaking process in Senegal and just a few points about this. The first is that while the hackathon itself brought together about 80 attendees, overall the process actually activated more than 1,000 citizens. There were more than 50 activities. We used some innovative platforms like the Facebook chatbot, and as I mentioned, there were more than 20, or there were exactly 20 iterations of the Startup Act, rather. And in addition to the co-creation of the Startup Act itself, this process being so open actually generated some really important and beautiful reforms that were outside the scope of a startup-specific law. And so in addition to the Startup Act, the sort of co-creation process initiated by this policy hackathon also derived major reforms to the 2020 finance law in Senegal, which benefited all small businesses. And so I have 3 of those points here. And it's just, I think it's really important to emphasize this, that they were able to simplify taxes. So they went from 11 different tax rates to 2 rates. They reduced business registration fees by 60%. And they created a 3-year tax holiday for the smallest companies in Senegal to be able to support those firms to become more sustainable and to grow. So that's sort of an overview of how this policy hackathon process has been used in the Senegalese case and how that contributed to a larger policy reform process and dialogue. And then by way of moving towards the conclusion of my presentation about policy hackathons, I'll just highlight 3 key lessons learned. The first is that it's really important to be clear in advance about roles and participation. So I mentioned this a bit before about how it's important to open this up. And it's also really important to be clear about what is the role that the government plays. I don't know what the balance is here between development partners and government and private sector, but many of my my government colleagues over the years have lamented the fact that whenever they go to a public-private dialogue event, they're just answering questions the whole time, and they're not able to really listen to the private sector. And so what we do is actually in the hackathon, we designate the government officials as observer status. Also, any funders, for example, that really protects the integrity of the event by having the funders in an observer status. But essentially, the government being in an observer status allows them to present what they see as the challenges, but then to step back and listen to the conversation. And everyone there knows that the government isn't there to contribute to the problem solutions, kind of co-creation and brainstorming and hacking, right? So that's the first thing, to be able to indicate the government officials as observers and to be clear about everyone's role in the event. The second really important lesson about this is to be sure that you articulate a very clear common goal. Why is everyone there? In the case of the Senegalese Startup Act and that hackathon, it was very clear. Everyone was there to co-create inputs to a national law that would accelerate entrepreneurship in Senegal. Very clear problem statement for the event, so that when everyone comes in, they're all pulling in the same direction. The third key lesson that's important to highlight about the policy hackathon is that it's critical to embed the hackathon in a much larger, policy reform process. So really to situate it, to make sure that you have the inputs going into the event, so you have this common interest that you can articulate, but also to make sure that you have government champions on board, that you have key people from the ecosystem really activated, and then in addition to that, you make sure that there's an off-taker for the event. So you don't do all this great brainstorming and then everyone walks away and we have another fantastic event, but that you really ensure that the inputs of this event feed into a really strong policy dialogue afterwards. And with that, I see that my colleague Suzanne is here to take the mic. So I will just appreciate everyone's attention for joining this short presentation about policy hackathons, and I'll be sticking around for some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you for explaining to us how to organize a policy hackathon, which is quite an innovative tool for making an inclusive reform process. And now I want to open the panel for the questions of the audience. So to the participants, if you have questions, you can type them into the chat box, and I am happy to send them to the speakers. And I can see that some questions are coming up. Let me see. So regarding the gender-sensitive public-private dialogue, so that's a question for you, Friederike. You explained it as being originally an evaluation tool, but also mentioned that it is applicable to other phases of the business environment reform process. And maybe can you explain this a little bit more in detail? So how can it be applied to different reform phases?
Yeah, of course. So obviously the public-private dialogue is something that should happen throughout the process, right? So in an ideal scenario, we would hope that at the diagnosis stage, when we try to figure out what the problems are, there is some form of consultation with the private sector. And then when reforms are designed, they again, there's a process of collecting feedback and of exchanging ideas, of getting expert opinions. And then the same throughout implementation, having in place some feedback circles. And so given that this is a PPD tool, even though the original intention for it was basically to just apply it to an already passed PPD process or structure to basically evaluate how did that go, was that inclusive or not. We think that you might just as well, do the same thing, but sort of on an ongoing basis. So when these kind of consultations are set up, already thinking about how can we make them more inclusive, or when you're thinking about, okay, I'm starting a reform process, I'm starting to think about what are the issues, and who do I need to talk to, and how can I get them engaged in order to find that out. Already thinking about, okay, are there some voices that are not being heard? Why not? How can I make sure that they're included? And so that's why we sort of suggested to just use this tool sort of throughout the whole process, really, to not just do this like ex post assessment in the end, but to look at it from the start and to make sure that designing the processes in a more inclusive way from the start. Of course, not each and every item on this checklist will be ticked off all the time, and not everything will be relevant in each and every process, but we think it's a really good analytical exercise to do to think about these things in a proactive way and in a targeted way, rather than just letting them go the way that they have always gone, and in that way can have a really good impact.
Great, thank you, Friederike. And now we have another question, which is about engaging government officials. So I can read this question to you. You are lucky if government officials answer questions over and over again in a PPD. In our climb, most of the government officials try as much as not even attend such PPDs because of non-performance and disconnect from small business owners. The question is, how do you get them to participate in the first instance? And maybe, John, you can reply from your experience, maybe also from the experience of organizing policy hackathons. How do you engage government officials?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are ways and ways to engage governments, as one of my best friends in Rwanda often says, and there are ways and ways of doing things. And the approach that we often take is to start by asking the government what they want. I think oftentimes people think of these PPD platforms, and particularly private sector groups, as sort of advocacy platforms. We're going to go and tell the governments what we need. And of course, that's not a good approach for public policy advocacy. It's not a good approach for business either, really, if you ask me. And generally, what we see is that it's much more effective to go to the governments and ask them what they're trying to do. In the case of startup and innovation policy reform, for example, it's very rare that governments aren't looking to activate more young people productively in society. It's very rare that governments aren't interested in more tax revenue, for example. And while businesses don't necessarily want to pay more taxes, they definitely want to make more money such that they would pay more taxes, right? So what we find is there's actually a lot of commonality in what governments want and what private sector wants. It's just a matter of articulating it such. And so we find that the way in which we can frame the dialogue is really important. And if we're able to frame the dialogue in such a way that government understands these common interests, then we generally have no problem having governments. In fact, many governments are approaching us. I would say at the moment we're working with President's office in several countries across the African continent and ministers across several countries for the precise reason that governments want to address many of the same challenges that entrepreneurs do. So it's really just a question of how we frame this dialogue. I don't know if that helps answering your question.
Thank you, John. Now we have another question on how to combine tools, and it's a specific question, so I can read it to you. Do you recommend combining the results chain and DCD standard for result measurement, or everyday political analysis tool and the DCED standard for result measurement? So maybe Ben, I give this question to you. Can you reply to the question, how to best combine tools?
Yeah, great. Well, so one of the things that I think I mentioned at the start is that we really were conscious in choosing the portfolio of tools, that we were choosing ones that were complementary to each other rather than overlapping and duplicating. And so what that means is that in the toolbox itself, for each chapter, we actually note where a tool might be nicely combined with another one. And so where it can actually be used in concert with some of the other tools within the toolbox. So that applies very much here. So in terms of the question about whether to use results chains with the DCD standard for results measurement, certainly, and not least because results chains are actually one of the key components of of that standard. So they are indeed a critical component. And so, yes, definitely, I would suggest that that is a great combination to do. The reason, though, that we actually separated out results chains and put them as their own chapter is because they have so many benefits, even if you don't end up wanting to apply the rest of the standard. You can, and also can be useful not only in terms of the measurement and evaluation processes, but in terms of the upfront design. And so we wanted to make sure that the users of the toolbox, even if they didn't want to use the full standard, would also consider using the results chain as a tool itself. And that applies very much also with everyday political analysis, which I think was the second part of the question. That's a great tool for getting a pulse check on essentially how is the political environment evolving. And that's, I think, one of the great benefits of that tool is it is such a quick to apply tool. That's what made us want to include it within the toolbox. And it means, therefore, it would be a really great tool to use as part of a measurement system to essentially be periodically understanding how is the political economy evolving. And it's nice because it is such a quick to apply tool that it doesn't require a huge amount of resources to do so.
Yeah, I also want to mention one thing, and that throughout the toolbox, we've also always tried to link up the different tools. So not just these ones, but throughout, I've always tried to mention, if you want to do something here, that other tool could also be helpful for this. And so we've basically tried to make it as integrated as possible.
Thank you, Ben and Friederike. To continue with the topic on tools that are easy to apply, we have one question from someone asking, investment climate reform tools like PPD, hackathons require tools and resources that many funders and donors are reluctant to fund. Which innovative tools have you identified are being used by organizations like business networks and mobilizing resources for policy and advocacy work? So yeah, maybe you can elaborate on this question.
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in to take this question. It looks like from Edwin of Social Enterprise Ghana. It's a great question, and I think it speaks to a bigger challenge, which is like how to fit dialogue into a log frame, right? Because dialogue doesn't have a particular outcome. It's not a linear process where you say, okay, we're going to have dialogue about this, and by the end we know we're going to be talking about that. It's like innovation. You can't anticipate the outcome in advance. Otherwise, what's the purpose of the dialogue in the first place, right? And so it's very hard sometimes for funders to kind of fit this into the way in which they work. But I would say that that's changing. Again, to quote this Digital Economy Task Force report between the African Union Commission and the European Union Commission, it emphasized the importance of policy co-creation. And we're finding that many funders are increasingly willing to be able to invest in dialogue. And so, when you ask what tools are being used, for example, to by business networks and otherwise to mobilize resources and funding, I think it's I can't point to a tool or a software that's being used, but what I can say is that it's really important to put the effort in really building a coalition. If an organization were to go to a funder and say, we want to have a dialogue, the first question is going to be, who's we? And what do you want to talk about, and what is it going to achieve, And so I think if you can answer these questions, if you can put together the ingredients, then you're really likely to be able to find funders. And I would also encourage you not just to look externally, but many governments across the African continent are funding this. In the case, for example, of Côte d'Ivoire, the Fondation Jeunesse Numérique financed the first policy hackathon in Abidjan. And they're actually just yesterday, so this is almost 2 years later, they're just yesterday validating a final draft of their Startup Act. And it's to say that You know, be open with who you think is funding this. Talk to local companies, talk to your own government, talk to local foundations as well as external funders. Build that bigger we. Make sure that it's not just you as an organization representing others, but it's really a bigger group of people coming together, that you bring the government into that we, right? So the government is part of your coalition is really important. And then, you know, finally, it's just really, really, really important to be patient, because this process, as I mentioned, you know, in Senegal, is an amazing highlight of what public-private dialogue can accomplish. But it took 19 months, and there were many points in that process where, like, okay, maybe we're stuck. There's a presidential election. Are they still going to have this as a priority when they come back in the new cabinet next year? And so, you know, be patient and be persistent and be tenacious and have the long view in sight in public policy dialogue process is really important. I hope that's helpful, Edwin.
Thank you, John. And also Frederic, did you want to mention something?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that there are a few tools in the toolbox, like the advocacy capacity building tool. It doesn't help with fundraising, but at least it helps with, you know, building that capacity for advocacy, and you know, many of them are quite easy to apply. They don't require a huge amount of resources. But given they've been developed by the ILO, you know, that could also be an interesting organization to look to. And then, of course, Susanne.
Yeah, one thing I want to mention is actually the ICR facility also offers support for applying the tools of the toolbox. So if you are a public or a private stakeholder in the ACT, you can send us a request for technical assistance, and if you're eligible, we can also support you in applying the tools such as policy hackathon or the advocacy tool. So that's also an option. Let me have a look at the list of questions. Here I have a comment, not a question. The format of the toolbox is reader-friendly. The guiding questions included are very helpful to decide which tools are relevant to our work and which would address our concerns. That's good to know. Thank you for the comment. I'm quite happy about it. Then what else do we have?
I see another comment from Zambia that is saying they find the policy hackathon very useful, and that the participant feels like it might help with dealing with the participant fatigue and PPD activities. And I would just encourage, this is an important point, I think, for thinking about PPD tools more generally, which is that, you know, we often talk about hosting rather than facilitation when you're organizing a meeting, right? In the same way that you would think about hosting a dinner party, you know, it's not only about whether the food is tasty, you also want there to be like nice conversation. You want people to enjoy themselves. And I think that's a really important point about all of these tools. It's really important to bring the joy, to bring some excitement, to recognize that like the topics that are being discussed in these events are critical. We're talking about people's livelihoods. We're talking about making it easier for people to build businesses. We're talking about building more gender inclusive private sector environments. These are critical topics that affect many, many people's lives. And so they're important. And so it's important to inspire people at the same time. Nobody wants to sit in a room, you know, going through a checkbox and then signing off a piece of paper afterwards for the funder to say that they ate the meal at the end of the day. That's not achieving anything. It's really important to keep front and center why you're having the public-private dialogue, why it's important, and to keep that inspiration and the joy in the events.
Yeah, thank you, John. I think these are really nice words, also for closing our Q&A session, because time is running fast. But yeah, thank you for these words, and also thank you to Ben and Frederic and to John for presenting the tools in the toolbox to us. As you can see, and as you have already mentioned, there are many different tools out there which we can apply to reform the business environment while also considering gender-related and green growth-related questions, but also to make the policy reform process a little bit more innovative, and to engage participants. So with this, we have last question to the audience, because currently in the ICR facility, we are also considering to offer an extended virtual training course on the tools of the toolbox. It's still an idea, but we are considering to offer this. And of course, we would be interested whether you are interested in such a training. So you can answer with yes, no, or maybe if you're not quite sure yet. And it would be great for us to get a feeling for this. And oh, wow, okay, I can see that 94% are interested and only 6% may be interested, and no one is not interested. So that's very good to hear, and we will keep you updated on these plans and yeah, when these training session would start and so on. So before we close, I want to make you again aware of the support of the ICR facility, as we have mentioned a couple of times in the sessions. But yeah, if you now got inspired to apply these tools from the ICR Toolbox and you work with a public or private stakeholder in the ACP, your organization might be eligible for technical support of maximum of 90 expert days from the ICR facility. And you can get all the information on our website, where you can also find our online request form. And if I have not mentioned it yet, we also have a LinkedIn account where you can follow us to get our latest updates. So yeah, we hope you liked the session, and we invite you to give us some feedback via our satisfaction question. Thank you very much again to our speakers. Thank you very much for your participation. And also thanks to the audience. Stay tuned for our next online events and have a very nice day from wherever you might have joined.